Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Ask the CEO on day 2 of IF2020, the Virtual Ideas Festival. My name is David Weston. I am the editor of FORESIGHT, Climate and Energy. We are the essential read from Denmark on the global transition to a decarbonised economy, objectively reporting on what really matters. We specialise in long-form, in-depth journalism, investigating the real problems facing the shift to a net zero society and solutions to them. As well as our website, we're publishing 2 magazines in the next 12 months. The first is on green electrification, discussing the most practical ways to increase green electricity across our grids, homes, and industry. And the second will focus on how our cities will change to a new decarbonised world. You can find out more at foresightdk.com. Both our magazines are being published alongside major events organised by WindEurope, which brings me nicely onto this morning's guest, CEO of the trade body, Giles Dickson. Good morning, Giles.
Good morning, David. Good morning, everybody.
Giles is going to give a quick 10-minute presentation on the wind industry. Great opportunity for you to submit your own questions to him. Please enter them in the session chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll do my best to get to them during the hour we have together. For the presentation itself, if you double-click on the window with the slides, it will make them larger on your screen so you can see more clearly the details on them. Giles, over to you, and then we'll get to the audience questions.
Thank you, David. And good morning again, everybody, on this Global Electric Vehicle Day. David, I hope I can present where wind energy is in Europe today in slightly less than 10 minutes. I'm just going to show 3 slides which paint the picture of where wind energy is in Europe today. If we could look at the first slide, please. So the blue bars here are the gigawatts of wind energy installed in every country in Europe. You can look at your own country here. Germany has the most wind capacity installed. Spain comes second. The red bars are the share of wind energy in every country's electricity mix. Here, Denmark is number 1, but you can see in Germany, Ireland, Portugal, wind is already more than 1/4 of all the electricity consumed. Across Europe as a whole, wind in 2019 was 15% of all of the electricity that we consumed. Now, both the European Commission and the International Energy Agency see that 15% rising rapidly over the coming years. They both say that wind will be the number 1 source of electricity in Europe by at least 2040, and that by 2050, wind will be around 1/2 of all of the electricity that we consume in Europe. Bear in mind that today electricity is only about 1/4 of all of the energy that we consume in Europe. The other 3/4, it's the gas that runs your gas boiler at home. It's the petrol you put in your cars. It's the fossil fuels that are powering much of our heavy industry. Of course, that's going to change over the next 30 years, quite a lot. And the share of electricity in the total energy mix in Europe is going to rise from 1/4 today to at least 1/2 by 2050, which means that wind, as 1/2 of Europe's electricity by 2050, will then be 1/4 of all of Europe's total energy consumption by 2050. Now, what does that mean in terms of the build out of wind farms in Europe over the next 30 years? Let's look at the next slide. On the left, you see how much wind capacity we have in Europe today. Most of it is onshore wind. That's the blue. And the red is offshore wind. Then in the middle, you see what we will have in 2030. Again, Still, most of it is onshore wind, but major growth in offshore wind. And then on the right, that is what the European Commission believes is necessary in its 1.5-degree scenario for 2050 for the decarbonized European economy. Massive increase in offshore wind, as you can see, but an even bigger increase in gigawatt terms in onshore wind. That is what we are now working towards. Now, you might be thinking, gosh, that's a lot of new wind farms. Can we afford to do all of that? Well, let's look now at the costs of wind energy. If you want to build a new power plant in Europe, this is how much it costs you. You can see on the right, we have the gas. I should stress this is in Northwest Europe, and these are the Bloomberg New Energy Finance figures. They're not WindEurope figures, okay? Then, cheaper than gas, you have the solar PV. Remember, these are numbers for Northwest Europe. Then, second cheapest now, offshore wind, and the cheapest onshore wind. These are the costs of building the wind farms, operating the wind farms over their whole lifetime, and the costs of borrowing the money to build the wind farms, the costs of capital altogether in what we call the levelized cost of electricity. So that's how much it costs. So this is affordable. Wind is the cheapest form of electricity in most of Europe. Now, this is affordable, it's doable, we have the technology, and it brings significant additional benefits to society and communities. And I hope, David, that we can talk about those benefits over the remainder of the time. In terms of the key facts and figures, that's all I wanted to share at the beginning, just to set the scene. I'm very much looking forward to the questions that both you and members of the audience will want to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in. Obviously, it's been quite a tough year for many people, and the economy has particularly suffered as a result of the pandemic and things like that. In terms of the recovery from the climate and the financial climate, what are we expecting to happen within the wind industry over the next coming months? And do you see a big investment for wind energy?
Yeah, okay. Let me just say something first about the impacts of COVID on wind energy. So Europe's existing wind farms have continued to operate as normal. Yeah, all governments said, look, it's part of the energy supply, it's essential services. And so we were able to get all the necessary equipment and workers to existing wind farms. We have also managed to continue building new wind farms even during the first 6 months of this year. We built 5 gigawatts of new capacity in total, most of it onshore. There were some restrictions on activity in wind farm construction sites in some countries, but by and large, we were able to carry on construction activity. The factories around Europe that make wind turbines, and there are 250 factories in Europe making turbines or components for wind turbines. The wind industry employs over 300,000 people in Europe. And all of those factories, by and large, have kept operating. At one point at the start of the crisis, we did have to close the factories in Spain and in Italy. They reopened fairly quickly, and all of the factories are now operating fairly close to capacity, producing new wind turbines. We've also carried on this year announcing new investments in new wind farms. There were 14 billion euros of investments announced in the first 6 months of the year alone. And that means that over the next few years, there's a good, healthy pipeline of new wind farms that are going to be built. And that's very important because all of this is generating economic activity at a time when it is so badly needed. Now, looking ahead, what is the outlook? You've seen the figures for the further growth of wind energy that the European Commission want to see. There is a very large pipeline of projects that the members of WindEurope are developing to get us towards those numbers, okay? It just needs the right government policies to unlock all of those investments and allow all of those wind farms to be built.
Perfect. So what kind of policies do you expect to see come from the European Union?
Yeah. First of all, there are policies from the European Union, and then there are policies from national governments. Let's talk, first of all, about the national governments. National governments control the rules on the permitting of new wind farms, both onshore and offshore. Today, the rules governing whether you get a permit to build a wind farm or not, and the procedures by which you get that permit, they are both too complicated. It's difficult getting a permit for a new wind farm, and the process of getting one is too long and complex, okay? So national governments need to simplify the rules and procedures for permitting new wind farms. This does not mean a relaxation of environmental standards or any other standards about where you build the wind farms or how you build them. It's just a case of simplifying the rules and procedures. Now, in their national energy and climate plans for 2030, which all the EU governments have now submitted to Brussels, some governments have some good ideas in those plans for how to simplify permitting. But most governments sadly do not. And this is a top priority for us at the moment, to work with governments to help them to simplify their permitting rules and procedures. The second thing that national governments have to do is put in place very clear schedules for the auctioning of new wind farms and new wind energy capacity. So the way it works in wind energy is governments run auctions, okay? They say, right, who wants to bid in to be able to build a wind farm? Yeah, and if you win the auction, then there is usually some form of public financial support for the winner, okay? And increasingly, these are not subsidies, they're what we call revenue stabilization mechanisms, okay, or contracts for difference. So you win the auction and the government says, okay, so you're going to have this guaranteed revenue for, say, the first 15 years. If the market price is below that guaranteed revenue, we'll pay you the difference. But if it's above that guaranteed revenue, you pay back the difference to us. Okay, so it works both ways. Governments are paying out and they get paid back by us. It's what we call the revenue stabilization mechanism, the contract for difference. And it's very different to the old-fashioned subsidies, okay? And governments award these to the companies that win the auctions, to the wind farm developers that win the auctions, okay? Now, it's so important that governments make it clear to those developers of wind farms, we are going to auction X amount of new capacity over this timetable over the next 10 years. Then we have clarity and visibility about exactly how much new wind power governments want and when they want to build it. And the clarity and visibility is more important here than the overall level of ambition. It's much better for us and therefore for everybody else in society if a government is saying, we will auction 1,000 megawatts of wind every year, like clockwork, rather than them saying, well, we might auction 2,000 megawatts, but we haven't decided yet. That's no good. Yeah, because we don't know whether to invest in new factories in that country or not. We can't plan our own business accordingly. So this second key message to governments is clarity and visibility in your auctions.
Absolutely. There's something that's WindEurope's been talking about for a while now. I know we've spoken about it before. Do you think the governments are dragging their feet on this? And if so, why?
A lot of governments are getting it, okay? So the Dutch government has a very clear schedule for the auctioning of new wind capacity. The French government, in their PPE and National Energy Plan, have a clear schedule as well. Germany almost has a clear schedule. They haven't quite got there yet. They will do quite soon, we hope. Other countries have clear schedules too. Yeah. Spanish government, for example, has said as part of their new law on ecological transition, they want to auction 2 gigawatts of new onshore wind every year. Great. Many other governments still have some homework to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you think that the Build Back Better sort of push as a result of the COVID crisis and the financial crisis and the emphasis now on renewables and climate change will help speed this up?
Yes, we've seen some positive shifts in thinking in Europe's governments over the last 6 months. Before the COVID crisis, the Danish government launched a letter saying we must embrace the European Green Deal. And there were a few governments co-signed that letter: Spain, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, what you might call the usual suspects. COVID crisis happened, and more governments came in and joined the message of that letter, which is that the shift to renewables is good for the economy. It creates jobs and growth. And therefore, now, at this moment in time, there is even more reason to embrace it. I think at the last count, there were 19 out of 27 national governments in Europe that had co-signed that letter, including many in Central and Eastern Europe. And let me tell you something else. 6 governments, most of them from Central and Eastern Europe, have signed a separate letter saying the EU must ensure that as part of its wider industrial policy, there is a clear industrial policy for Europe's renewables industries. That letter was initiated by Lithuania. All 3 Baltic states signed it. Poland co-signed it. 2 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for the Polish government to be signing a letter saying, please let us have a European renewables industrial policy. The politics is shifting. Yeah.
I saw in your presentation by 2050 there should be 759 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity. That's an awful lot considering what
759. Yeah. That's the upper number in the Commission's range under their 1.5 degree scenario.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm flying to Denmark or flying over Denmark, and I see all of these wind turbines in the ground already. Do we have the space for that amount of wind turbines to reach that target?
Yeah. Okay, let me share some numbers with you. Germany has extremely ambitious long-term goals for the build-out of wind energy. And we have calculated that in Germany, and the German government broadly agree with this, you can deliver those goals with only 2% of all of the land space in Germany. We have huge expansion goals for offshore wind between now and 2050. We have 23 gigawatts today, and the European Commission is saying we need up to 450 gigawatts by 2050. That's a 20-fold increase in capacity. 450 gigawatts would take up 3% of all of the sea space in Europe's North Seas. North Sea, Northern Atlantic, and the Baltic. Okay, so we're not talking about a huge amount of space here. Now, let me share something else with you. A lot of Europe's existing wind farms have first-generation wind turbines on them. Okay, they were built 20, 25 years ago, and at the time, it was state-of-the-art technology. They were turbines that were 500 kilowatts, 600 kilowatts. Today's modern onshore wind turbines are 3, 4, sometimes 5 megawatts. Okay? We're coming to that point in time where Europe's first generation wind farms are approaching the end of their normal operational life. An onshore wind farm is built for 25 years. If you look after the turbines really well, you can get 35 years out of them. But a lot of first-generation wind farms are nearing the end of life. Some of them, we've already started taking down those old turbines and replacing them with modern turbines. And what happens when you do that? This is a process we call repowering, by the way. Well, you take down the old wind turbines and the foundations. You put new wind turbines up in their place on the same wind farm, and you can have fewer turbines, but you double the capacity. And because the new wind turbines are so much more efficient, you can treble the output. On average, of all the wind farms we've repowered in Europe so far, we've reduced the number of turbines by 1/3, but we've more than doubled the capacity and we've trebled the output. And there have been some extreme examples. There was one wind farm in Spain. There were 69 turbines. Okay, we took them down, we've replaced them with 7, and we're producing twice as much electricity. Yeah, so a lot of that will be happening over the coming years.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the policies and the regulations that need to be improved, but there's also the customer's side of it. Who's buying the wind power, and what sort of demand is there for that?
Yeah, okay. In the last 3 to 4 years, we have seen growing demand for wind power from different sectors of industry. And increasingly, companies are signing power supply agreements directly with wind farms. This all started in the ICT industry. The data centers consume a lot of electricity, of course, and companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, 4 or 5 years ago, started coming to us saying, right, we want to power our data centers directly with wind energy. And many of them now have 100% renewable energy targets. And so we started signing these agreements. They're called power purchase agreements. And many data centers around Europe are now powered directly by wind energy, and in some cases by solar energy as well. Okay, then some heavy industrial sectors started coming to us. Aluminium were the first. They're the most electricity intensive industrial sector. The electricity costs are the highest share of their production of any heavy industrial sector in Europe. And they started signing these long-term power purchase agreements as well for their aluminium smelters. And on the back of that, we've been building very large new wind farms in Sweden and Norway. Okay, now we've got other sectors doing this as well. Chemicals, steel, automotive. We've signed these agreements with Mercedes, for example, both in Germany and in Poland. Pharmaceutical, and each year we're signing more and more of these power purchase agreements. We're beginning to sign them now with public sector bodies. Last year, we signed one of these agreements with a large group of universities in the UK that want to source their electricity now directly from renewable energy. We're seeing more and more of this, and this is a really positive development.
Absolutely. I'm just going to, there's some excellent questions coming in from the audience. Now, one's on floating wind power, and what sort of potential that has to have in the energy mix in the EU.
Yeah. Now, if you look at the offshore wind we have today in Europe, there's 23 gigawatts. Nearly all of it is what we call fixed bottom offshore wind. So the foundations, monopiles or jackets, forgive the jargon, they are connected with a fixed connection to the seabed. You can only really do that when the sea is less than 50 meters deep. So you can do that in a lot of the North Sea, you can do it in a lot of the Baltic Sea. When you get beyond 50 meters sea depth, which you do in most of the seas around Europe, you need to move to floating offshore wind turbines. So far, there are only 2 floating offshore wind farms in the world, and they're both in Europe. One's in Scotland and the other has just opened off the coast of Portugal. Together, they add up to only 54 megawatts of capacity. By the end of 2022, we will have 4 more of these floating wind farms in France, 1 more in the UK, 1 more in Norway, and we will have in total 330 megawatts by the end of 2022. Many governments in Europe are very interested in floating offshore wind, France, Norway, and some others. And they are committing already in their energy planning to build large-scale floating offshore wind farms. We look at all of these plans, they're credible, and we believe that by 2030, we will have between 6 and 7 gigawatts of floating offshore wind farms in Europe. Now, how much does it cost? Today, floating offshore wind is more expensive than fixed bottom offshore wind, but the costs are falling, as they do with all of these new technologies, when you start to commercialize them and when you start to establish economies of scale. Okay? We believe that by 2030, we will be generating some floating offshore wind energy at a cost of between 40 and 60 euros a megawatt hour. It's all about the scale. The faster we can build these gigawatts of floating offshore wind, the faster the costs will come down.
Absolutely. Floating offshore wind obviously opens up lots more areas of development. Yeah. Why is it taking so long to really get to that scale?
Okay, look, it's more complex as a technology. It's perfectly logical that the wind industry should have started off with fixed bottom offshore wind. Yeah, not least because there are lots and lots of sites and still loads of sites to develop for fixed bottom offshore wind, notably in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Okay. If you're France, Spain, Greece, Italy, Ireland, and you look at your own potential for offshore wind, it's mostly floating, okay? And increasingly these governments are saying we should be developing floating offshore wind. So Spain is developing its first ever offshore wind strategy. Spain has a lot of wind. It's all been onshore so far, and they have a really great industry for producing onshore wind turbines. Actually, their industry is also producing equipment for offshore wind, but it's all been for export so far. But now Spain wants to start building offshore wind themselves. And they're thinking maybe we can have around 3 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And it would be mostly floating because of their geography, both in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic and Bay of Biscay. Ireland is a really interesting one here. So, of course, they have a new government, coalition government between the 2 main parties and the Green Party. And the coalition agreement says, let's have more fixed bottom offshore wind by 2030. They've more than doubled their target. Most of that will be in the Irish Sea. Great. But it also says, let's aim to have up to 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind off the west coast and the south coast, because we can export it. The wind resource there is so good. And we're going to build an interconnector directly from Southwest Ireland to Brittany. So let's export all this floating offshore wind that we can generate into the continental European market. So they have big ambitions as well. They know that the costs will come down. One other observation with floating offshore wind, when we build fixed bottom offshore wind farms, we take ships and cranes out to the site, out at sea, and we install them there in the wind farm site itself. With floating offshore wind farm, you can assemble and build the turbines on the port in the harbour, and then you drag them out to the wind farm.
Absolutely. And obviously, so offshore wind, all of these extra megawatts and gigawatts of capacity is going to really need human power, human jobs and investment and things like that.
Yep.
So what else does the industry bring to society? You mentioned in your presentation what you wanted to highlight some of the benefits to society that the industry can create.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, there is the jobs, 300,000 today, as we've said, with the expansion of both offshore and onshore wind envisaged by the EU over the next 30 years, that number will grow. Okay. In addition to the jobs, and by the way, there's another observation about jobs. Those jobs are either in factories or they're in wind farms. Onshore wind farms tend to be in the countryside, often in more remote parts of the countryside, often in areas where not many other industries are investing. And in many rural communities, we have become the main local employer. Okay, it's one reason why support for wind energy onshore is so strong among the communities that live close to onshore wind farms. Consistently, we see in opinion polls between 75 and 80% of the people who live close to an onshore wind farm support onshore wind energy, okay, and they support the local wind farm. Okay, now, in addition to that, the factories are often in industrial areas that have been suffering economically. We've just built a very large blade factory for offshore wind turbines in Hull, in the northeast of England. And British viewers will know what sort of town Hull used to be. Well, now it's booming, thanks to offshore wind. Cuxhaven, port town in Germany, other port areas. We've created 10,000 jobs in Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Szczecin in northern Poland, for example, in areas that have been suffering from the decline of European shipbuilding. Okay, so there's the jobs. Then there are the direct economic benefits to local communities that go beyond jobs. So every onshore wind farm pays taxes to the local municipal government. Okay, on average, it's about €3 a megawatt hour for the electricity that they're generating. Okay, now those taxes add up. There are many town halls around Europe that are getting 10% of their revenue covered by the taxes that the local wind farm pays. Okay, and this is strengthening the finances of local governments. It's bringing direct benefits economically to local communities. There are then many examples around Europe where local communities have taken out a stake or a share or some participation, community participation in the wind farm. So they earn revenues directly from the operation of the wind farm. Then we have also the environmental benefits. Okay, now where you build wind farms, farmers can carry on grazing cattle, they can carry on growing crops, and they can also earn some revenue from the local wind farm. Okay, we don't put wind farms where we know that there are migratory routes for birds. We are very sensitive about where we locate them. We work very closely with environmental organizations and charities, especially with bird organizations. Yeah. And overall, the environmental impact of both onshore and offshore wind farms is positive.
Great. You mentioned the number of jobs there, but surely with the increase of wind power, it's going to remove the need for fossil fuels, which is, I guess, the idea. But those people are going to lose their jobs. Is there some sort of way that the people from those industries can be retrained?
Yeah, a lot of this is happening already. So we have seen a lot of people transfer out of the offshore oil and gas sector into offshore wind, and they bring skills and experience and know-how that is invaluable to the development of offshore wind. Okay, we are beginning to see in parts of Europe coal miners retraining now to work in wind farms. There's a program that we are launching in Romania, which is doing this. In Poland, we are exploring this as well, with the authorities, and we want to formalize this. We want to start reskilling coal miners. It takes us 6 months only to retrain a coal miner to work on a wind farm. Clearly, they bring technical skills, and clearly they bring experience of working in extreme physical conditions. Yeah.
So there's lots of benefits to the wind industry, and that's great. It brings jobs, it's bringing investment. But the wind industry itself is going to have some sort of carbon footprint. And there's all these turbines. You mentioned the thousands of turbines that were installed, the first generation turbines that are now being pulled down.
Yeah.
What is the wind industry doing to help reduce its footprint on the environment and to do with recycling and the circular economy?
Yeah. Okay. Let me be completely upfront here. Wind energy, across its whole life cycle, building the turbines, transporting the equipment to the wind farms, installing them, does consume some energy. Of course it does. All economic activity consumes some energy. But we pay off that energy consumption within the first year of the lifetime of the wind farm. So an onshore wind farm will operate for 25 years. It's paid off its so-called energy cost before the end of the first year. Okay, that's the first point to stress. Now, when wind turbines get to the end of their normal operational life and we repower the wind farm, we take the old wind turbine down, we take the foundations down, and we recycle today between 85 and 90% of all of that equipment and machinery. We want to go higher than that. Okay, the blades are the hardest thing to recycle because there's glass fiber, the composite material, carbon fiber inside those blades. Okay, and we are working very closely with the chemicals industry and the composites industry to find the most efficient way of recycling all of those materials. We are getting there. Okay. And our plan, as I say, is for us to be fully circular as an industry. Precisely because we are a clean energy industry, it's all the more important for us, wind energy, that we should be completely circular.
And what about where the materials, the original materials, are sourced from? Are they going to be recycled, or there's sometimes you have to be they're mined? Some of the metals have to be mined. So you mentioned the carbon fiber. Where are those materials going to come from, and is there a way of making them more sustainable?
Yeah, they are sourced from all around the world and from Europe. So the glass fiber, some of it is sourced from Europe, some of it is imported, from Asia. Okay, it's a globalized industry. Yes, we have 250 factories in Europe, but like all other industrial sectors, we are importing raw materials and components from outside of Europe. We have globalized supply chains. That means it's extremely important that Europe should defend and uphold free trade. Free trade is very important to the competitiveness of the European wind industry.
Absolutely, yes. Lovely. So we're just coming to the end there. If anyone has any more questions, please do put them in the session chat on the right-hand side of your screen. One more from me, Giles. I noticed, I think it's next week will be your 5 years since you were named the CEO of WindEurope. I just want to reflect slightly on how you found the last 5 years, what have you learned, and what perhaps the next 5 years hold.
Look, wind energy is a great industry to be working in, and I would strongly encourage anybody in the audience who is an engineer or technician, no matter where you are in your career cycle and development, think about the wind energy industry. We need civil engineers, we need mechanical engineers, we need electrical engineers, we need planners, we need people with softer skills, communication skills. It's a great industry to work in. There is a great sense of purpose in this industry. Yeah, everybody is very committed to helping to deliver the energy transition that we all want, and they are committed to delivering, not least at this point in time, all the economic benefits that come with the further expansion of wind energy.
And how have you found the last 5 years then of your leadership at WindEurope?
Well, look, I'm in a very privileged position. We have over 400 members of WindEurope, the entire value chain of the industry, the big turbine manufacturers, the component manufacturers, others in the supply chain, those in the logistics chain, doing the installation or the shipping of wind turbine components. Yeah, we then have the companies that are developing wind farms, the big power utilities. Nearly all of the major power generation utilities of Europe are members of WindEurope. So it's a real privilege for all of us who work for WindEurope in Brussels to be working with all of these companies and other organizations, research institutes and organizations, academia, the national wind energy associations of Europe, to be helping collectively to drive this expansion of wind energy, the energy transition, and all of the societal and economic benefits that will come from that.
So, yeah, you mentioned the need for a lot more engineers and people like that. Those sort of jobs are quite male-dominated industries. What's the industry doing to perhaps bring more women into the industry and make it a more equal sector?
Yeah, we are not diverse enough, I'm afraid, in the wind industry today. We want many more women at all levels of our industry. Yeah, those women that are in the industry really enjoy it, okay? And because they enjoy it, we, together with the Global Wind Energy Council, have recently established a scheme, a program of women ambassadors in the wind energy industry. And we are working with governments and academic organizations and other societal bodies to do everything we can to increase the number of women working in our industry. It's a top priority for us.
Absolutely. Great. Just finally then, can you give some arguments to why wind perhaps is an option for the energy transition? When I first came into the industry a few years ago, there was a lot of sort of misinformation about the industry. There's a lot of skepticism about the industry. Can you provide any sort of facts and figures or arguments that perhaps would improve the viewpoint of wind power for the average citizen?
Number one, it's cheap. It brings down your energy bills, the more wind energy we have on the system. If you want to build new power generation capacity, wind is the cheapest option in most of Europe. Building new wind farms is now cheaper in much of Europe than running existing fossil-fired power stations. Wind uses the local resource, the wind. We don't need to pay any money to import fossil fuels from outside of Europe or from anywhere. And Europe is spending today 5 billion euros every single week importing fossil fuels. Okay? Second argument, wind is good for the environment. Of course, it reduces CO2, but there are no SOx, NOx, or particulate matter. It's very good for air quality. We also consume hardly any water. Let's not forget, water consumption is going to become a very major environmental issue in the coming years. It's good for local communities. It provides jobs, often in areas where there are not many other jobs being created. Okay, it brings revenue to local communities and to local municipalities. Okay, There are many reasons for embracing wind energy.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Giles. That's all of my questions for today, and I hope everyone had a very insightful hour with you. Please do stick around at IF2020 and look at what else is going on today. And other than that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention, and we'll hopefully see you very soon at a show or another webinar. Thank you very much,
David, and thank you to everybody who's been listening in. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Giles. Thanks, everyone.